Jubilant New Yorkers had been waiting for this moment and gathered outside the courthouse in Manhattan as news of the jury's momentous verdict trickled in.
Guilty!
It took them just under 10 hours to pronounce Donald Trump guilty of all 34 charges.
Guilty!
Branding the former and still perhaps future president, the highest office in the land, as a common criminal.
Count 26! Guilty!
Only this criminal lives in a golden tower.
If they can do this to me, they can do this to anyone.
Donald Trump predictably cast himself as the martyr today in a 40-minute monologue where he claimed he'd already raised nearly $40 million in donations off the back of his conviction.
It was a rigged trial. We wanted a venue change where we could have a fair trial. We didn't get it. We wanted a judge change. We wanted a judge that wasn't conflicted. And obviously he didn't do that. Nobody's ever seen anything like it.
The salacious case of the former president and the adult film actress Stormy Daniels was a risky bet from the very start. Other New York prosecutors had pored over the evidence years before and concluded they could not bring charges against Donald Trump. And yet New York's District Attorney Alvin Bragg made the bold decision to bring the case anyway last April. It was a stunning moment in American legal and political history, the first ever indictment of a former US president. To win their conviction, though, the prosecution persuaded the jury that Trump had engaged in a cover-up, falsely classifying hush money to Stormy Daniels as legal expenses to silence her allegations of an affair that Trump believed threatened his chances of winning the 2016 election.
Everyone wants to pick on the fact that he slept with a woman, but it's really not about that. It's about keeping information from the American people in advance of an election.
Down the felon! Down the felon!
Unsurprisingly, in heavily Democratic New York, there was celebration that the brash billionaire appeared to have got his comeuppance.
Finally, some accountability. He is not a Teflon Don anymore. He's a convicted Don. Don the felon!
But there was visible pain for the Trump devotees.
Save America!
He was wrongly convicted. The man is innocent. Who cares who he sleeps with, if he goes to see prostitutes? I don't care.
I see you bought the wig.
Oh, yes. Well, I'm trying to support my guy. Draw attention to our side, too.
So he's your guy. You must be feeling pretty glum.
Yes, we're in shock. I still don't believe it. People love Trump.
The jury of his own peers has convicted him.
It's New York. It's a clown show. What do you want?
In a divided country facing an election, the verdict now presents Americans with a stark question. Can they back a convicted criminal as their next president? It's been 5 weeks in the making, but today the jury has spoken. And Donald Trump is today leaving this court, the former president, as a convicted criminal. Not an understatement to say that that is history right there. In the melee, we ran into the court artist who captured Donald Trump's face the moment the verdict was read.
The jury foreperson read the verdict, and as soon as the foreman said guilty, he shut his eyes, and he looked down, and then he shook his head.
So he looked emotional?
Oh, he looked angry and depressed and aggravated.
Donald Trump is furious, but we know he'll try and wear his convictions as a badge of honor. And it doesn't stop him running or even becoming president in November.
So I don't think this conviction will ultimately have an effect on the outcome of the presidential election. I don't think it's a good thing. I'm sure he didn't want, to have a guilty verdict, but he will somehow turn this into a campaign speech.
But for those maybe sitting on the fence, he could actually lose some support potentially.
Yeah, I think that's right. Maybe those sort of tweeners, if you will, who will now be less inclined to vote for someone who has a criminal record as this country's president.
That's the million-dollar question that Trump no doubt will be agonizing over as he remains holed up in his Manhattan skyscraper today.
Guilty! Guilty! Guilty!
How, if at all, the guilty verdict will impact him in the polls ahead of Election Day. It's still too early to say, but one thing, though, is for sure. This first conviction of any president, current or former, in US history will reverberate, not just in November, but for decades to come.
Well, in the last half hour or so, Joe Biden has broken his silence on the verdict, saying it reaffirms the American principle that no one is above the law. What happens next for Donald Trump? Well, he is due to appear in about 6 weeks' time on July the 11th in that court there behind me for sentencing. Of course, that will be about 4 days before he is due to be anointed as the Republican Party nominee to run for president at its convention in Milwaukee in Wisconsin, setting up the bizarre split screen moment where he will no doubt be hailed as the hero, just as he has been sentenced as a convicted criminal. The judge could give him anything up to 4 years, as you mentioned, but that is seen as unlikely. Trump is a 77-year-old man. This is his first offence, and it is a non-violent crime. But the mayor here in New York says that the notorious Rikers Island prison is ready to receive Donald Trump if that's the way the judge chooses to go. It is more likely, though, that he will face a fine or some form of community service, or the indignity, more likely, of probation, where he will be monitored but most likely allowed to continue to carry on campaigning. One thing that we do know for sure, he has confirmed today, is that he will appeal the conviction and the sentence, and that this is likely the only case that will be heard between now and November, because the other 3 far more serious criminal cases against him around January the 6th and stolen documents, Donald Trump has successfully managed to kick into the long grass.
Siobhan Kennedy. Well, I'm joined now by Mick Mulvaney, who was Chief of Staff at the White House under President Trump. Thanks for joining us. Would you agree that whichever side of this argument you're on, this is a really bad moment for America, because you have a president and a presidential candidate who is now a criminal convict, and his response is to undermine the American judicial system and say it's all rigged and it's terrible?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways to look at it. If you're a Trump fan, this is terrible, because what it means is that we're becoming a banana republic where people pursue their political opponents using the criminal court system in order to sort of prevent your opponents from challenging you in an election. If you're a Trump opponent, you're faced now with a convicted felon possibly running, or certainly running, and possibly winning the presidency. So regardless of what your politics are, this is not a happy time in terms of American politics.
I mean, doesn't it also mean that more and more Americans are being encouraged to distrust their own system of government, their own separation of powers, their own judicial system? You know, and a lot of Americans already don't trust the judicial system, and this will make more of them.
In fact, you've hit on something there that I think is just starting to sink in here in the country in the last 12 hours, 24 hours, about there are a lot more people here who have a distrust of the system that I think a lot of us, myself included, believed. There's been several interviews I've seen on TV, and I recognize that anecdotes are not data, but several interviews with people saying, you know what, now Donald Trump knows how we feel. They know how I feel, that I've been singled out in the past, that we, a minority group, for example, has been singled out and mistreated in the past, and that maybe Trump now has an empathy for those voters that he didn't have before. So yes, I think there's a lot of folks who look at this and say, you know what, what's happening to Trump is what could happen to me. And they're thinking about voting for Donald Trump for that reason. It's just bizarre.
Do you actually think this will change votes? I mean, when you think how narrow the election comes down to just, 7 states, a small number of undecided voters, do you really think this could change things?
I think he lost votes last night. There's no question. There's going to be a certain group of people who will not vote for a convicted felon for president. That's for sure. But if there's a large number of minorities, of African Americans, of Hispanics who say, you know what, Donald Trump now gets it. He can speak to me in a way that my Democrats can't, and I'm going to support him because he's being mistreated just like I've been mistreated. That is an interesting question. So he lost votes last night. It remains to be seen if he can make up enough votes to sort of still maintain his leads in those states, but it's going to be fascinating to watch.
I mean, given everything he has said about immigrants to America, he's been widely accused of saying all sorts of racist things over the years. Do you think that's a credible thing that black voters and Hispanics could think he's now he's on their side?
Mitt Romney got about 4% of the African-American vote in 2012. Donald Trump got about 6% in 2016. He got 12% in 2020. In the last national poll I said had him at 23% amongst the African American community. Again, I don't understand it, but I'm a suburban white married male, so it's a different demographic group. But yeah, it certainly seems that Donald Trump is reaching into the minority groups in ways that other Republicans have not been able to do for a long, long time.
So do you think he's now looking more likely to be president?
No, I think the jury's still out on that, to use a bad metaphor, and I apologize for that. No, I think he lost votes last night. Whether or not he can continue to take his victimization message to the folks that would ultimately propel him into the White House remains to be seen. But I don't think it's safe to say, and I've done a bunch of media today with people saying, well, clearly the election is over and Joe Biden has won. That nothing could be further from the truth. The race was close yesterday, and it's still close today, and will be close on November 6th.
Right, and as more cases come up, and there are some, 3 big cases still to go, do they have the same effect, do you think?
Probably not, just because it's unlikely that any of those, any of those 3 cases will be actually heard and adjudicated before the election itself. So while it still hangs over the president, a former president, while it will still take some of his time because he may have some pretrial motions, et cetera, that certainly generate a lot of press, we don't anticipate another jury coming back with another decision before the November election.
While you're with us, can I just ask you about another breaking news story that's happening at the moment, which is that Joe Biden has announced what looks like a new deal offer for a ceasefire in Israel, Gaza. If Joe Biden can bring about peace in the Middle East, how much of an election boost is that for him?
A good bit. I think that would help bolster his foreign policy credibility. He has struggled mightily with the situation in Gaza. As we refer to it here in the U.S., he's got a problem with the 3 I's, which is inflation, immigration, and Israel. And if he can participate in drawing the hostilities to a close, that would certainly help him, no question.
Mick Mulvaney, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.